Welcome to the Matthew Moran podcast. Here you will find a series of in-depth conversations with the world's best nature photographers, filmmakers, conservationists, editors, writers, and publishers. You will get an insight into the lives of creative professionals and industry experts. What goes on in their minds, how they approach their work, and how they make it pay. The podcast also looks at the role that photography and filmmaking plays in helping to raise awareness about the global plight of species. And despite the depressing statistics, we look for solutions at what we can all do to contribute to conservation. All my guests give up their precious time and are incredibly generous of spirit. So this is my chance to share these conversations with you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. This week, my guest is Doug Gimesy. Doug hails from Melbourne, Australia, and I was lucky enough to meet up with him here in London during the week of the Wildlife Photographer of the Year and WildScreen Film Festival. And Doug was at these events as another award winner, and he continues to stay at the forefront of wildlife conservation and animal welfare photography. Back home in Australia, Doug focuses on local subjects and also campaigns at a local and national level. I don't want to waste any more time talking. We packed a lot into this one, and Doug had just flown in from Australia, so it was a heroic effort. I hope you enjoy it. Doug, welcome to London, and thank you so much for not just taking the time to come over here. This is the first time in a long time that I've had a guest face-to-face in my studio, and you have come a long, long way from Australia, and props to you for actually just being awake.
Yes, no, thank you. My absolute pleasure. It's been a long time that Australians have been allowed to leave the country, so that is fine.
That's right. Yeah, it's funny how with COVID you kind of can quickly forget. I mean, no one's wearing masks anymore, but of course Australia was pretty strict, wasn't it?
We had a 262-day lockdown in Melbourne, which made photography a little bit difficult.
But have you come out of the traps flying since then? I mean, you're producing lots of content all the time, pretty active on social media, working on so many fronts. Did being held back mean that you came out and you needed to do everything that you've been doing?
Gave me 262 days to clean up my emails, so I suddenly had no administration to do and I could go out and shoot. I mean, we could still travel at one stage 5 kilometres from home and at another stage 25 kilometres from home, and I pretty much focus most of my work on conservation stories close to home, so there were some limitations, but it wasn't as onerous for me as it probably was for a lot of people. And I must admit, I quite enjoyed the quiet. I mean, because of the lockdowns, the skies were silent. I live near the bay, and so there were no jet skis, no motorboats, and it was really quite nice for wildlife. I got some beautiful gannet photography close to home, and some photos that we'll probably talk about in Wildlife Photographer of the Year close to home. It was just quiet.
Yeah.
And I really, that part I enjoyed.
Yeah, that's great, isn't it? And I think that was a story for so many for lockdown and then interesting to see now what also is coming out in the competitions, in the kind of major publications, are people turning their attention to close to home, which is a good thing.
Yeah, and look, I think it was great for animal welfare. I mean, we have a subspecies of dolphin in Port Phillip Bay, where close to where I live, and some research found for the first time they could communicate with each other across the bay because there were no jet skis or no noise, environmental noise. And I think a lot of wildlife benefited from the natural quiet that came from that.
Yeah, fascinating. So why are you here? What are you doing in London? Obviously, apart from featuring on my podcast.
Yeah, well, I came for the podcast, but I'm staying for other things. I've lucky enough to have an image this year in Wildlife Photographer of the Year. It's in a single image in the photojournalism section called Wombat Lockdown, and it was taken during a COVID lockdown in Melbourne. And the story is basically a girl I got to know pretty well during our bushfires 4 months beforehand had come to Melbourne from her wombat sanctuary about 450 kilometres away with 3 baby wombats in tow to do a little bit of work in Melbourne just for a day or two. And she got stuck when the Ring of Steel went up around Melbourne and she wasn't allowed to leave. And she's living in a top floor apartment about 7 or 8 kilometres from the city, and she had to look after these 3 baby wombats and couldn't leave. And it was a beautiful story because what she would do is she was growing grass on her balcony from the area where the wombats would go back to, because their gut biome needs to become accustomed to the type of soil and environment. So you'd be feeding them soil and sticks from the area, but living in this top floor apartment. And we were both trained initially as microbiologists, so we were pretty comfortable being in close contact. And this was really early on in the pandemic. This was May, so not much was known about COVID, but it was still within our 25-kilometre travel distance. So I'd go to her apartment and I'd fully PPE up and wipe down my equipment before and after, and I was sort of just documenting her work. And the photo in this year's Wildlife Photographer of the Year is of her working from home with two baby wombats, Landon and Branson, sitting on her couch in a homemade pouch enjoying the sun.
It's beautiful. Actually, I've just Doug's to show me the picture, and again, to me it definitely has your style and your feel, and there's some humor in it as well. Of course, this sort of everyday scene of someone sitting on their laptop, but just happen to have a couple of sleeping wombats next to them.
And it's funny. It's a beautiful photo, but it's a sad story, because the reason she's looking after them is that their parents, their mothers, which survived the bushfires that virtually devastated everywhere where Emily and the Goongarra Wombat Orphanage is, subsequently, a few months after surviving our bushfires, got hit by cars. And so they're orphans, and that happens with a lot of marsupials in Australia, because they're in the pouch. The parents, the mothers, take the brunt of the force. And so the wombats can often survive, which is a really important message for people listening, especially in Australia. With whoever see a wombat hit, it's always important to check the pouch, because there could be a live young wombat in there that's dying this slow, awful death of hypothermia or dehydration or starvation. So for me, road trauma is a big issue for us in Australia, especially. And I call it road trauma versus road kill, because we know that about 50% of all animals hit don't die straight away. So they'll either, if it's a kangaroo, hop off into the bush and die these horrible deaths, or live a life maimed. But it's not only a trauma for the animal. For most people who hit an animal, it's traumatic, and it's traumatic for the carers as well, and traumatic for the infants. So, I think, to me, I'm hoping that people will read the copy and understand that there's a important animal welfare message in there, which is A, slow down, and B, check pouches if you drive past one, and just don't assume the dead body on the side of the road is the only body that's been impacted by this car.
Yeah, that is great advice, and we'll put it out there for sure.
Yeah,
and it's so sad, when you think about their homes are being burnt down, and then as a result of that, their chances of them getting hit are that much greater. It's just so brutal. I mean, it's already tough to be an animal living in the wild to survive. And in the the odds are so stacked against you, and then that can happen.
Well, and the bushfires were brutal for our wildlife, obviously, for the reason for the bushfires. I mean, the data is now 3 billion animals burnt to death, and I say the frame burnt to death because it's not like a quick death. It's anyone who can understand burning is awful. But then what happened when the rains came for the wombats? You go, great, it's rain, but because there's so much ash, the rain became effectively turned the ash on the ground into mudslides, and it filled up their burrows. And so then some were drowning from mudslides, and there's no food. And so these horrific impacts of bushfires and climate change go on a lot longer. And I think for me, it drove home that virtually all conservation issues are animal welfare issues. And we sometimes talk about, species going extinct or species numbers reducing, but that's because they're starving to death, or they're being drowned or burnt or something else. So for me, I view virtually all conservation issues now as animal welfare issues.
Yeah. And, we've already touched on you being very active kind of post-COVID. And you've also mentioned briefly that you worked in bioethics. And, one of the things I think, you're my only guest that basically took up photography at the age of 48. So there's a story in there, in itself. And one of the things that we often talk about, me and, Neil, my colleague on the book, and Andy, and photographers of a similar age, is how hard it must be for young people to get into this field. But you decided to start it at 48. So I can only assume that you must have, some massive trust fund.
Well, my background, it's a sort of an interesting story. I always wanted to be a National Geographic photographer, and I did a zoology degree at university, and this was in the days of film, and I tried for a year, but I wasn't good enough, and there's probably a lot of reasons. One was technical skill, and secondly, I was never trained, and also maybe my confidence, and maybe even my passion. And I diverted my career for many years. I did a few years research as a zoologist and botanist, but ended up working in pharmaceuticals and ended up being a director of a multinational pharmaceutical company. And my joke is, how do you become a conservation photographer with $100,000 in the bank? It's really quite easy. You start 10 years earlier with $1 million. And for me, it was, I made the decision that I wanted to follow my passion. And I'd been doing some other conservation work more as a corporate role. I sat on the board of Environment Victoria, but it was very corporate with my corporate skills because I was a suit, and I was also lead governor of WWF in Australia. But I realised as a conservationist, a more powerful way to influence people in the world was by good imagery, and also I just wanted to get back and do it. And so I picked up the camera again. I just tried for a few years.
But during this long period, I mean, I don't know how long we're talking from, having this dream of...
From mid-80s to late 2010, 2012.
Right, and when was photography? Obviously, photography went through a huge shift during that time from film to digital.
Never picked up a camera.
Never picked up a camera.
Besides a point and shoot for holiday photos. And what really happened was I decided to do a holiday to Antarctica, and I thought, well, if I'm going, it's a once in a lifetime trip, and I might as well take some good equipment. So I got some pretty good equipment, and I took some photos, and I fell in love with it again. And then there was a website that was called National Geographic Your Shot, which is now an Instagram site, and I put some images up, and the editors liked it, and then one contacted me for one, and then I thought, oh, that's not too bad. And I carried on a little bit. And then I just started entering competitions. And at this stage, I wasn't a serious photographer. And then I got a Photo and Wildlife Photographer of the Year. And that sort of gave me a bit of confidence. And then I made the decision that I would quit my corporate work and focus on photography and try and make a difference that way. But I had been, I guess, for conservation, trying to make a difference being on a board and doing more the corporate side. But there wasn't really an artistic outlet, and I sort of seemed to be okay at it, and I sort of loved it. And but yeah, it was a close to a 35-year gap.
Wow, that's amazing. But you also have a degree in zoology, is that right?
Yeah, so I've got a degree in zoology and microbiology.
Yeah.
And in one of my many midlife crises, I ended up doing a Masters of Environmental Policy and Governance, and also a Masters of Bioethics, partly with Peter Singer. And I don't know if your listeners might know Peter Singer. Peter Singer is the gentleman who basically started the whole concept of animal welfare and sentience. He's co-adjunct professor at both Princeton and Melbourne University, and I think Oxford or Cambridge, so he's a pretty smart dude. Doing that was one of the keystone parts that made me realise that conservation is an animal welfare issue as well, because there's suffering and pain, and it's an important thing to address.
Yeah. And were you concerned in the early days of photography? Also, a lot of photographers now who are working in the conservation field would have been maybe 5-10 years ago, pure wildlife photographers looking for technically beautiful images of wildernesses, and those kind of days of we talk about this a lot on the podcast, disappearing. I mean, even if you just look at what is being shown now in some of the major competitions, it's much more conservation focused, because these organizations, Wildlife Photographer of the Year or European Wildlife Photographer of the Year, they have a responsibility in a way, because they've got this great platform to show to millions of people that the imagery is changed in terms of what's getting recognition, and also storytelling. So did you think when you went into photography, you already knew that this is what you were going to do, was tell stories and try and get exposure to some of these much needed
Absolutely.
campaigns?
I'm a conservationist who takes photos, not a photographer who works in conservation. I've always been, I guess, a greenie is a good way to to put it, which sounds a bit ironic as I was wearing a suit in a pharmaceutical company, but I've always cared about the environment and animal welfare. And for me, it was always about two things. It was about the wildlife, but it was also about the people. And something that I've realized early on, or I thought early on, was that most conservation issues are caused by people and most conservation issues are solved by people. Therefore, you'll probably see 40% of my photos have people in them, either doing good things or doing bad things, normally good things. But I think for me, my photos, if they're visually attractive, great. But at the end of the day, I want photos that drive people to behavior. And whether that's to start doing something or stop doing something or change what they're doing, to me, if a photo doesn't have an impact that's behavioral, it's a bit of a waste, because even if people go, wow, that's really important, I wasn't aware, and do nothing, well, nothing sort of changed. So I'm very conscious of driving behavior. And I think that came from being a director of marketing in pharmaceuticals. It's sort of the good side, trying to buy back my soul, is recognizing that all good and bad things happen from behavior, not intent. So we need to influence people's behavior. And I think your book, your Fox book, is a nice example that, when I looked at it, it's beautiful, but also you get empathy. And from that empathy, you want to get people to slow down if they're driving through a city, or, I view foxes very differently. My behavior to seeing something and talking to people has changed because of it.
Yeah. And that's, I guess it's the hope, I think is, I can be a cynic. I mean, I think we all can, but cynicism doesn't really get you anywhere. If you want to affect change and you've got a skill and you've got some humility and you're good at building relationships and talking to people, then you can use those skills to highlight an issue together with, sound science. And because, one of the things that Charlie Hamilton James said in a recent podcast, which really stuck with me, this idea of raising awareness. He said he hates that phrase because he said the awareness is raised. We know how bad the situation is. It's about taking action.
And look, having worked in pharmaceuticals, in an area I worked in was oncology, and back to raising awareness, I don't think there's virtually anyone on the planet who doesn't know that smoking is bad for you. Still a lot of people smoke. So it's about the behavior change now. And, I'm not judging people if they want to smoke, people's choices, but it's not about smoking causes cancer. It's about, if you want to do something, changing the behavior. And it's not about human-induced climate change. It's about addressing that now as well.
And your story-focused photography, kind of going back to age 48, which I hope you don't mind me telling the audience. No. That was 12 years ago now.
Yeah, I was 60 last week. So
congratulations. It's young.
I made it.
It's young these days. There's no excuse.
It's the new 40s.
Exactly. But yeah, I've listed some of the, the topics that you've photographed here, some of the species, flying foxes, koalas, wombats, also, people surrounding all of this work and rescue work. Yeah, platypuses. And
it is, for the listeners, it is platypuses, not platypi. I do need to make sure everyone understands that because it's a Greek derivative, not Latin.
Okay.
But if you wanted to be perfectly correct, it'd be platypoides, but no one uses that. So it's platypuses is the plural.
And we can see Doug's attention to detail here. This is very important.
Bit of OCD, yeah, absolutely.
And what drives you to shoot a certain species? Let's face it, they're all in trouble. Why pick flying foxes, for example?
I think with the zoology degree, I get naturally curious and I fall in love with them because I'm naturally curious, and the more I know about them, the more I fall in love with them, and so the more I want to help them. So I don't really strategically go out to pick a species, except for the platypus. And the platypus is something I always wanted to do because when I graduated as a zoologist, my very first research was on the diving physiology of platypuses, and that's nearly 40 years ago. And so I've always loved them as a species. They're unique. They're a monotreme. They lay eggs, and they're pretty misunderstood and not really known in as much that they're so secretive. And I wanted to raise awareness because they're sort of a flagship species because they represent the health of a river. If a river's not doing well, they're not doing well. And also they're a little bit, I think the technical word is stuffed in as much that if you think of platypuses, the only way they can connect to each other to breed and genes and everything is through rivers. And in Australia, we dam rivers, we suck water out of them. So it's a bit like blocking a freeway. And so we've started to fragment the population. And I think that's something that was really important to talk about. One of the top platypuses researchers in the world says, it's death by 1,000 cuts. And I've always cared about platypuses, so I just wanted to raise awareness. And I'm pleased to say that it's one of my images is going to appear on a stamp I found out last week, which is pretty cool.
That's amazing.
Nice to raise their awareness.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. Yeah. And do you, when you're doing these stories, and obviously the point is to get them out there and to educate and inform people, but do you have any examples of the success of this? Any idea of policy change? Because I know that's something that you're interested in as well.
Absolutely. I work with people to change policy, but I think the best example, and again, I'm a conservationist who takes photos, so I work a lot behind the scenes on policy and conservation change. So there was an issue in Victoria where platypus were drowning in what's called opera house nets, which are like a crustacean yabby trap. And what would happen is fishermen will put these nets into the water to catch crustaceans, yabbies, sort of like little lobsters, if you don't know them. And they would go in, and then the platypuses would go, well, there's food, they would swim into the nets and drown. So brutal drownings, and then the platypus would start to rot, and then other crustaceans would go, great, there's meat, and it started eating the platypus, and another platypus would go in. And so it was like ghost fishing. And I was with a researcher one day, and we found 5 drowned platypuses in 2 nets, which is about half the population of the river. And at that stage, I just went, this is bullshit. This is just outrageous. We've got to get these things banned. There are plenty of other alternatives. So I took some video, and I ended up getting in front of the ex-premier of Victoria. I went to a function as a photographer, sort of not snuck my way in. I got my way in as the photographer for free, so I could have a chat to him and pulled out the video and showed him. And he was absolutely amazed or outraged. And he said, let me see what I can do. And then we started networking. And then a year later, those nets were banned. Yeah. But it was from that footage. It wasn't a great photo, but it was using the power of imagery of showing 5 drowned platypuses in 2 opera house nets that did it. So I try and use my images as policy changes or awareness changes. Recently did a kids book on flying foxes that you've seen.
Yeah, which you've kindly just given to my daughter.
Absolute pleasure. Yeah. And that's now in 30% of schools and in Australia. And kids seem to love it, which is great. I got a random email from a parent whose child had dressed up as a flying fox.
I think I saw this. This is on Instagram. Yeah, it's so cute.
Yeah, and to me, that change is getting children to fall in love with animals that are often vilified and not understood. And flying foxes have had a hard time with COVID, even though it didn't come from flying foxes, as the recent data shows. And I say that with my microbiology hat on.
Yeah.
And if you can get kids to fall in love with wildlife, I think that it gives us a little bit more of a hope for a future, because the data shows that most people's values and attitudes are set by about the age of 10.
Wow.
And so when we did the book, it was strategic to aim at an audience between 5 and 10. And
was that the plan from the beginning?
Absolutely. Yeah. I did a bit of child psychology earlier in my life, and it is, if you've ever seen the series 7 Up, you sort of know when a kid's about 10, you know which way. Now, things do change, of course. If there's a traumatic event, people's attitudes and values will change, but pretty much it's about 10 to 11 they are set. So I basically thought if I can get kids to fall in love with flying foxes by the age of 10, it's playing a long game, but it's an important game. So, for me, it's influencing the younger generation is a key strategy. So, that's something I've done.
Well, it's absolutely beautiful. It's called Life Upside Down. And I love the imagery in it. So full bleed, beautifully designed by your partner.
Yeah, my partner Heather Kiley designed it. I took the photos, and together we did the words. And Australian Geographic were kind enough to virtually sell it at cost. I mean, they're making a little bit of profit, but it's 48 pages, full color, and it was $19 Australian.
Great. Well, we'll definitely put links to it where people can buy it.
Which is probably £10.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely fantastic. Moving forward a bit. So, I think in your very relatively short career as I don't know, do you call yourself you don't call yourself a photographer, first of all.
I call myself a conservation and animal welfare photojournalist.
Yeah. But you got involved with the International League of Conservation Photographers. We've had quite a few people on this podcast who are also involved. So can you tell us a bit about your role with them and what you do?
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to be a senior fellow of the iLCP, and it has some incredible world famous photographers on there. So I'm not sure how I snuck in.
So you still have imposter syndrome?
I always have imposter syndrome, and I'm not being humble. I when I was made a senior fellow, I remember having a chat to them, going, "Is there a level below that because I feel that I shouldn't be on the same level as Joel Sartori? I feel wrong being at that level. So can you put me a bit lower?" And they go, "No, there isn't." No, okay. But my role on that is I'm lucky enough or unlucky enough. I think lucky enough to chair the ethics committee. So we've just redone the iLCP ethics guidelines, and that's been great because it's been able to bring people on a journey, but also having a master's of ethics and having taught ethics, it was probably a little bit easier for me to pull together a set of principles with a team than others who didn't. And so that's been really, I've really enjoyed doing that. It's probably my main contribution to them.
That's great. And sure, it's your speciality for sure. And can you talk you don't have to go into great detail, but I think a lot of photographers, certainly I'm interested in, this idea. In fact, we were talking about this with your Life Upside Down book, when you're looking at the glossary and you see these words, like climate change, pollen, species, and actually trying to describe those things without reading about it, just from your head, it's very difficult. And so, ethics, I could have an idea of what that means, but what's the message that you're trying to get across to not only the members, but everyone who's working in this field of nature photography?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I guess most people when they're interviewed say that's a good question because it gives them time to figure out an answer that is well thought out. I think there's many type of ethicists, and I think I'm pretty much what you'd call a virtue ethicist, which, okay, what's that? It's very Aristotelian, and okay, what's that? It's what would a good person do? But I think it's about being kind and considerate, if I had to boil it down. Now, the ethics principles don't specifically say that, but if you go, okay, what's kind and considerate, and kind of considerate to the people you work with, kind of considerate to the wildlife. So I'm starting to shift away in certain circumstances, say, from using flash, and it depends on the animals. I see photos of, say, a nocturnal animal where someone's blasted off flash, and you sort of go, okay, so that animal's got incredibly sensitive eyes, so that's going to be painful. And then it's a short-term stress, and you sort of go, okay, well, maybe it's okay, but it might blind it from feeding, from evading predators, and especially, say, in Australia, we've got gliding animals, and I've seen photographers punch off a flash with an animal mid-flight, and to me that's the equivalent of walking into an aeroplane while a pilot's about to land and punching off a full flash and going, good luck spotting that landing. So I think it's about thinking about those things, and I would never say never do it or don't, but it needs to be thought about, and secondly, justified. And if you can sort of go, look, this one photo will save a species and it's going to cause a bit of stress, I think if you can honestly, rationally justify it versus going, oh, it's just going to be a cool photo for no other reason than I've taken a cool photo, I think that's sort of the way I view things. So I'll never look at an individual photo and go, well, that's just ridiculous, unless, it really is ridiculous. But I just think it's about being kind and compassionate, and again, thinking about the end game. And I think with photography, you'll notice in my captions, I'll often say taken under the supervision of wildlife experts or wildlife carers, just so people know that I just haven't taken the photo, but the animal welfare has been considered in that photo. Now, maybe the animal was a little bit stressed when the photo was taken, but if I'm with a wildlife expert, they can go, okay, I'm calling it Doug, or no, that's okay. It doesn't stress it because it's got a different visible spectrum, or it's used to it, or I'm taking it daylight. So I just think it's about being considerate and also thinking of the impact you have, and the, I guess I'd say the standards you set for others. There's certain photos I've taken that I wouldn't take again because I'm worried it might set a bad example, and it's not that necessary. I mean, in my book, Life Upside Down, there's a photograph I've taken of a flying fox in captivity, and it looks like it was taken at night, but it's actually taken at the day with a black background, and the reason was so I could use a bit of flash, but because it was daytime and the pupils were more constrained, it wasn't stressful to it, although it looks like it was nighttime because it was to show what they do at night, and it's all very explicit. I think that's the thing with photography. It's about being honest.
Sure.
If you're going to do something, just be honest. I've had people who've contacted me and said, "Oh, Doug, I like that photo, but could you change it?" And I go, "Well, look, if it's not going into press and it's for you, and it's just going to hang on your wall, and you're not going to say this is taken in the field, I don't mind if someone photoshops something as long as it's totally explicit. But if you do a photo and you put it out there and it's not what happened or what you saw, that's being deceitful. So I think being transparent and honest is really, really important, especially when it comes to captioning. And I think I don't think you can ever over caption, to be honest. And I'm pretty conscious of trying to do that and just give it extra information.
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting because I wonder whether some photographers think by being honest, it's somehow restrictive. But actually, you can see in terms of what you can do with an animal. Do you know what I mean? If some photographers think, oh, I could get away with this as, taking a photograph of an animal, I'd probably pushed it a little bit too much, but no one needs to know I'm not, but the flip side of what I'm saying is that what you're doing is being really honest, writing up detailed captions about your work and still getting in competitions, still regularly being published in top publications such as The Guardian or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's a hindrance to the actual quality of the photograph or the regular output you're doing. It's actually in a way that being pure and being honest is helping.
It's a bit liberating. I could think of nothing worse than if someone sort of did something dodgy with a photo and it did well, and then they're hiding in fear to be found out. I mean, or they do get found out, which has happened many times in WPY.
Yeah.
I think it's not worth it. And I also think that in this time of fake news, the last thing we want is fake conservation photography. I think we want scientists to be trusted, and we want photojournalists to be trusted. Again, if you're an art photographer and you collage things, great. Everyone knows it. I mean, anyone who watches Lord of the Rings doesn't walk away thinking there's no CGI in that. That's okay.
Yeah, sure.
But it's about expectations and aligning and being transparent and honest with those, and that's absolutely fine. I've seen some beautiful wildlife photos, and they've declared that there was Photoshop. And okay, if you want to buy that, great, but it's not going to be run in The Guardian or National Geographic, and that's okay as well.
Yeah,
you're being trustworthy, which again comes back to virtue ethics, I guess. What would a good person do?
Yeah, I think it's nicely put like that. I was also interested in your approach, and again, a lot of the one of the great things about running this podcast is I get to dive in. It's supposed to be altruistic. I'm doing it for the audience. I'm totally doing it for myself. I get to meet you.
That's obvious. Yeah.
But we talked a little bit on when I met you from the station about trying to make it pay. And okay, whatever, you have $1 million and then you have
I didn't really have $1 million.
I'm kidding.
And it's Australian dollars, so even if I did, it's like it's nothing.
Sure. But you do have to make it pay. And in your relatively, again, short career, it's you go on a website and again, we'll put the links up to it. You've got great information on there. It's packed with stuff and lists of all your publications, but it's really varied, and you seem like you're very active in terms of trying to get stuff out there and getting published. What I know as a photographer is there's not a great deal of money just in getting work published, and you have to do all sorts of other things. So how did you go about from the beginning? Okay, after this trip to Antarctica, I want to try and actually make a living from this. I want to make it pay.
Yeah, I made the decision that what I was going to do two things. I was going to firstly work on the premise that I wouldn't go backwards in my mortgage. So if I could have a year where I survived with food and experiences and didn't go backwards. And then, interestingly, I started trying to add in a value to my experience. And I know that sounds sort of a bit crazy, but to give you a nice example, I was lucky enough to go to South Georgia to document the recreation of Shackleton's Crossing with Tim Jarvis. Now, to do that, I had to train 2 hours a day for nearly a year. I had a whole lot of skills, and that's not paid for. And I went on this trip and documented, and it was a total of 3 weeks away, and a short movie's been made. And, I didn't make very much at all for, I think I've calculated it was something like $8 an hour for all that work. But to do that trip, if I was self-funding, would have cost me $50,000. And so I suddenly go, well, I've just been paid $50,000. And then secondly, I camped on South Georgia. I climbed glaciers on South Georgia. Virtually no one's allowed to do that. So let's make that $50,000 $100,000 experience, because I had this incredible experience. And then I spent 3 weeks with Tim Flannery, who wrote The Weather Makers, who's a top climate scientist. So I had all these really, really cool experiences. So I started to add in, I guess, conceptually, if I had to do that, what's that worth? So for me, it wasn't about making money, but it was not about going backwards and then having the best experience. I think in my role, I think I have the worst paid, best job in the world. And but again, I'm 60 and I have the luxury of having nearly paid off my mortgage, and I think that's sort of different to someone who's starting out. But a key thing for me, whatever anyone's doing, is fairness, and that's that if someone wants your images, you should be paid fairly for them, and that's just a value I have for everything. If someone's painting a house or doing anything, I think they should be paid fairly. I've had experiences where CEOs of not-for-profits who are on $200,000 a year have said, can we have one of your photos, but we can't afford to pay you? And I go, well, you're paid, so why should I not be paid? And please feel free to write me a personal check and I'll give you a tax invoice, because that's only fair. But then I've had organizations where no one's on a salary and they're all doing it out of the goodness of their heart, and they want an image for a campaign and no one's getting paid. And so I think, well, I'm happy to donate that as well. And to me, that's just fair. And I guess, and with generosity. And I think they're the two things I always think about. What would a generous person do, and what would a fair person do? And that sort of makes the decisions easier for me. But I do have the luxury of not having a huge mortgage and 5 kids at school. So it's a little bit easier than maybe those who don't.
Of course, there's not a one size fits all when it comes to it. But what you say and what you said to me when we were walking back, it seems fair. All we're asking for is to be paid fairly.
Yeah, absolutely.
The problem is and something that I said to you is I feel that there needs to be a kind of a grassroots movement in that. How do we get to be paid fairly in the industry? How do we educate young people to know what their image is worth, and not that a credit is mandatory? That should never be an incentive. That should just be a given.
Well, in Australia, it's law.
Right.
It's interesting. I literally sent an email last week to a publication who will remain nameless for legal reasons on my side, but a news publication, and they just wrote image supplied, and under the Australian copyright law 1968, moral rights exist and they have to be given away. You can't assume you don't have them. So if you don't give credit, unless the artists have said, don't credit me, you've literally broken the law. If you misrepresent the image, you have literally broken the law. So in Australia, it's pretty good that way.
Yeah, that is really good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that, my partner always says to me, you need to do something about it. Because, it happens to me, it happens to you, it happens to all of us in the field. And at the moment, I don't have the time or the energy to do it, but let me
send you a stock letter. And I literally just changed the dear sir, madam, whoever it is, and the link, and it's standard. And I did one on the plane. It was literally cut and paste, and you send it off.
Yeah.
And I think,
but the more of us that do that, I think the more of the more the attitude will change, hopefully, because I think, photography, obviously it has its value, but it's been hugely devalued by the internet, by everybody being a photographer. But the good thing is, we're both with Nature Picture Library, and they are a functioning picture library in very, very difficult times as well. And they have employ great picture researchers and people that have science backgrounds, zoology backgrounds, and they're doing it and they're making it pay. And obviously that always helps when it comes to negotiation because they're doing it on your behalf.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's one of the things I definitely, I do feel really strongly about, that we need to keep the conversation going, but also like getting it out there that, for younger people listening to this, just don't give your work away for free. Unless, like, you talked about, there are these circumstances where
I think generosity, if it's generosity can be fine and win-wins are fine, but don't do it just for the sake of putting it out there, because I don't think it's always a win-win. I think I was telling the story, I had someone say, if you give me the image, we'll credit you. And I said, come paint my house, we'll credit you. And the conversation changed really, really quickly because it just didn't seem fair. But I have given away images to, small not-for-profits where no one's on a salary because I felt like being generous, and that's okay as well. But I think as a standard practice, it is it's unfair on other photographers as well. If you make the whole concept of high-level photography low-level. I've had the conversation where someone said, I can't pay for your image. And I say, well, if you think it's worthless, you probably don't want to use it. And I know that sounds a little bit arrogant, but what they are literally saying is it's worthless because we're not paying for it. Or if they say we haven't got a budget, I honestly say to them, well, that's a budgeting issue, not a value issue. And, I'd like a new car. That's a budgeting issue, not that give me the car for $10 because I haven't been able to budget for it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, beautifully put. Well, hopefully this, will resonate through and, change a few hearts and minds, which is what we're trying to do with everything. So yeah, all of these different species, different stories, different publications, iLCP, ethics, I often ask photographers, how do you find time for it all? But you're also shooting video as well, and anyone,
a whole new world of pain. I think I'm too old to really to get into it. But I've started. I was asked by a production house whether I did it, and I went, I'll give it a shot. And I have found that I won't probably become a cinematographer, but in the TikTok generation, 15 to 20 second clips seem to be really, really engaging, and I think it depends on the piece. I just don't think it's just putting, a soundtrack to some boring imagery, but sometimes moving footage tells a story better. And so for me, it's something that I haven't been good at. And I said, it's a whole new world of pain. But I think important.
And storage, a whole new world of
whole new world of storage and metadataing and learning and is all I can say.
But you're also a qualified drone pilot.
Yes.
And I've seen your lovely images of Lake Eyre, which got some great coverage again.
Which was not drone, that was plane.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was shot at 2,000 feet. So a lot of people think it's drone, and no, that's me in a Cessna 172 with the door off, strapped in, flying over Lake Eyre, because that is high altitude. So no, I'm not sure if I'm complimented or insulted to people who think it's drone. I'm going to go insulted, actually.
I guess these days, when you're thinking about budget, the gone are the days when you hire helicopters and planes to get your aerials. Everyone's doing it with 4K drones. But can you talk a bit about the background to that project, because it's quite different, shooting landscapes from the air, and why you did it in the first place?
Oh, look, the first place was just serendipitous that I had to be in Adelaide for judging a competition, and a friend of mine who's I'd say an aerial expert said, well, I'm at Lake Eyre, which is 1,000 kilometres away, but straight north from Adelaide. And he said, but I'm driving up from Adelaide to get there. Spare seat in the plane. If you're flying early, I'll take you up there. And I'd never done aerial photography, and I went, sure. So, I had to pay, we split the cost of the plane. So yeah, it was expensive, but we shot these shots that were unique because no one was up there at the time. The rains had started to fill Lake Eyre, but normally it comes from the north, but these were desert storms that had filled it. So it was just a unique situation. And we shot a whole lot of stuff, and then The Guardian ran it. And then from that, for some reason, I got known to be a lake aerial photographer. I don't know, and I'm not, but I don't know how that happened. And then I got contacted by some researchers for a TV special on the impacts of oil and gas mining north of the lake, because Lake Eyre is the one of the biggest and probably one of the most pristine desert lakes in the world. And good old lucky us, we've got, I think it's 862 gas and oil wells north of it, which the floods come through. And there's just a lot of issue. It blocks the floods, there's leakage. And I got contacted to do some video and some stills of that. And the stills were quite easy, but the video was a little bit tough. Again, had to hire the same pilot with a Cessna 172 and shooting video.
Yeah, I mean, also we shouldn't assume that everybody knows about Lake Eyre and the issues. So can you talk a bit about the background with that? Because obviously you're not going to go to Lake Eyre and take pretty pictures. There's got to be a story behind it.
Yeah. Right? So as I said, Lake Eyre is a big inland lake that's normally dry. It's a salt pan, and it's beautiful and it's huge. I think it's 100 kilometers wide, and I forget how long, but we'll call it 100 by 100. And it's got its own natural environment. It's pristine, and occasionally floods will come through from what's known as a channel country and fill it up, and from that crustaceans and eggs hatch, and then it becomes live with wildlife. It's one of those sort of Attenborough, middle of the desert. You get pelicans there. Wow. It's in the middle of the Australian desert. It's absolutely frogs, come out from underneath, and it's incredible. And but to the north, east of it, we have some gas reserves and some oil reserves. And whenever there's mining. And of course, when the floodwaters come down from the northeast, the danger is that those get flooded. So there's issues there. But also because of the roads they build, it changes the flow of the floods. And so where water's meant to go, it doesn't. And so I got contacted by one of the head researchers, Professor Kingsford, who said, "Can you do some footage?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." So we flew up there, and I had one of my few life-death experiences doing that, because I was in the plane and the doors were off, and I had my seatbelt on, but I had it loose so I could move around. I had my foot out of the plane on the strut where you would normally stand if you were parachuting, and I'm shooting away, and we're banking, and the pilot was an expert low-level pilot, and we were going pretty slow, and I said, "Can you bank?" And we're banking, blah, blah, blah. And I said, "God, my seatbelt's loose. How loose is it?" He goes, "It's come undone." So we were banking, and I was literally the only thing that was keeping me in the plane was my foot on the strut.
Wow.
For about probably 5 minutes. And what had happened is my camera strap, as I turned around, had caught the latch and just obviously undone it at some stage. And that was one of those, afterwards got the sweats and went, wow, that would have been interesting. Yeah. I've had a couple of those, but
I mean, you would have been really famous.
Yeah. I said to him, I said, what? And he goes, I said, what was your thoughts? And he goes, my first thought was, man, the paperwork I'd have to do if you fell out of my aeroplane. I'm like, yeah, fair call. But would have raised attention about the issue we were covering, I guess.
No doubt.
So, yeah, look, having said that, my partner, we often joke about it, that if I was to die, my fear is the eulogy that, I would rather that than the eulogy to read something like, Doug was backed over in a car park while someone was looking at their mobile phone. That would be the worst eulogy in history.
Of course.
Not that I want to fall out of an airplane, but I think that was a come to God moment.
Yeah. Was it then after that moment that you decided that you were going to fly drones instead?
No, that was only 6 weeks ago.
Right.
Wow. So no, it's that was I've had a couple of those, but I'm 60, so I've made it so far.
Brilliant, good stuff. Right, so I also wanted to talk about, there's so many things that you have done in the last 12 years, and I wanted to talk, or can you tell us? Because I was interested and curious about the framing effect.
I would love to talk about the framing effect. Having worked in pharmaceuticals, a key area I worked in was communication and science communication. And an epiphany I had early on when I was on the Board of Environment Victoria, that scientists are awful communicators. I'm sorry, but if they were such great communicators, we wouldn't be talking about climate change. I mean, when I was a zoologist, I knew about the impacts of climate change in the early 80s. And so there's been this problem that a lot of people think more data changes behavior. And I can tell you it doesn't. And again, we come back to smoking. And we all know, and so the framing effect, interestingly, it's not photography. The framing effect, the concept of framing and communication, it's a meta-communication concept where how we frame an issue changes how we view it. So, for example, if someone said to me, this water is 99% pure, I could go, what, you mean it's 1% polluted? And would you drink it if I said it was 1% polluted? And it changes how people engage in an issue. A nice one with climate change is, people talk about by, say, 2030, we need to do ... And I go, well, that's 7 years. That's what you mean in less than 2,500 days, we've got an issue. So framing it as days versus years is very, very different.
Sure.
And so I set up a consultancy to help not-for-profits and scientists communicate using frames a lot better. And one of the ones I'm really passionate about is the poorly used frame habitat loss. Because we don't lose habitat. Again, I remember having a chat to the CEO of a not-for-profit who will remain nameless, and he said, we're losing the Great Barrier Reef. And I said, well, I can give you the coordinates. We're not losing it. It's being destroyed. And a frame like loss is very neutral. It's a noun. There's no moral responsibility. I mean, if you lent me one of your cameras and I said, Matt, look, I'm so sorry I've lost it. Sure, you'd be annoyed. But if I came back and said, look, I destroyed it, there's some type of action and moral accountability. And whether I destroyed it deliberately or I destroyed it by negligence, it's a very, very different frame.
Of course it is.
And it changes the argument. And a couple of other sort of frames.
But it's also a little bit like, George Monbiot talking about wanting to change the words climate change to climate breakdown. Because change is it's a quite passive word, isn't it? Well, loss, it's almost like, what a shame we're losing this.
Yeah, well, I've got a sheet I've been pulling together the last 7 years called Frames to Embrace, Frames to Replace, and Monbolt's works in there as well because, he has some really interesting frames. A recent one that I've sort of had an epiphany about, we talk about natural disasters, and I've sort of gone, well, unless it's an earthquake or a volcano, because we've impacted the environment, we've changed the environment, is it natural anymore? Are these natural disasters or are these climate change driven disasters and therefore human climate change driven disasters? People sometimes, talk to conservationists and go, you're a tree hugger. And I go, well, you're a concrete hugger. That's a reframe. It's like, I'd rather be a tree hugger than a concrete hugger. So framing is very much about being honest, but just literally framing things in a way that will get people to view the world through a different lens and hopefully from the person's perspective, a more appropriate lens. And again, when I mentioned road trauma, that's a different frame to roadkill because roadkill doesn't, whilst it's bad, the pain's over. Trauma is really, really different. So my consultancy that I do part-time, but also with all my captioning, I'm really conscious of the framing of how I frame key pieces of information.
Yeah, and making these changes, you're hoping that someone who might read road trauma versus roadkill, it just jolts them because I think you just become desensitized to these words, especially in our field. You just, you read all this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
But by reframing it,
I mean, look, even for the underwater photographers, when I hear the frame bycatch, to me it's a little bit, when you listen to war stories and they talk about collateral damage when a kindergarten's been blown up. And, collateral damage doesn't really cover what happened. And bycatch doesn't really, it's a oops.
Yeah.
It's
sure.
like bang.
It's exonerating of responsibility.
Yeah, and you can't tell me fishermen don't know when they fish in certain areas there'll be, let's call it collateral damage for fun. You're right. There'll be bycatch. And so it's not it makes it an oops, and it's not an oops. It's it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And if I drove through a school crossing at a speed and ran someone over and went oops when I knew it was going to happen, I'd be held morally accountable. So I think framing is a great way to engage people to what I think is the right way to view things.
And what are you doing with it? What's the plan? How long has it been going, and where are you going with it?
I consult wherever I go. I talk to people. As I've got to 60, I can send the angry old man emails of, "Dear editor, I believe."
Sure.
So, but I do. I know they're not angry, but when I speak with photo editors, magazines, I'll actually send them a framing list. I sometimes in the work I do, I'll actually say in the licensing contract, you cannot use the word habitat. You cannot use the frame habitat loss. I don't like people calling animals critters. It's really demeaning. I think call them animals, call them wildlife, but critter. If I called someone a critter, they wouldn't like it. So I have a list of words where I sometimes put in my contract, depending on who I'm dealing with. I actually say, you can't have the image if you're going to say critter. You can't have the image if you're going to use the frame habitat loss.
Yeah,
so I'm just trying to change people's how they communicate to help the environment.
Brilliant. That's great, Doug. So we did something new this time around. We put it out to the audience. You saw on social media
questions.
a couple of days ago. Yeah, I got a couple of questions from some audience members. From someone called Jules, who says Doug is a master of using artificial light in the field. I'd love insight on how that process works.
Wow, artificial light in the field. I'm using a lot now continuous lighting.
I like the way you ignored master.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. It's funny. A lot of my work, people think it's artificial light, and it's not, because I don't do a lot of night photography. So that's an interesting question. I've done some work with platypuses early on. It will always be with a softbox, but I can take a photo during the day and make it look like night. But sorry, the question was, how do I?
Yeah, she just wants to know your, the insight on the process. I mean, I think, looking at a lot of your work, for example, in the conservation setting, or your wombat picture, there's some fill flash in there, I'm assuming.
No, not the wombat one. No, that's natural light.
Right.
I mean, if you look at my last few posts, I think it's natural light. I've gone for that very Rembrandt room light. So my first consideration is to animal welfare, and I'll speak to the experts of, is it okay? It will virtually always be through a softbox. If you look at the specs of my images, I shoot really high ISO, which, I'd like not to, but I realize the higher my ISO, the lower the flash has to be, so the lower the intensity. One of the key things I consider with flash, I call it the lighting differential, and I'm not sure if that's a correct term, but I basically go, what's the ambient light and what's the difference of the flash? So you imagine shooting a flash at night, the differential to what the animal we experience is really high. It's from blackness to not, whereas during the day, it's like a glitter and or a sparkle, which I don't think would bother it. So I think a lot about that. And so that's the first thing I think about. And it always I always want it to be soft, and I want it to look like I've nearly used nothing. And I bounce a lot if I do, so I sort of fill the room if it's fulfilling. But occasionally I've done some softbox work, but I'm sort of moving away from that. I did a shoot just before I came out here, and I waited till the clouds had gone and the room was filled with natural light, and it was bounced around on that, because I think it's nicer as well.
And that's also the amazing thing, like you mentioned, just the capability of cameras now being able to shoot at high ISOs. It makes life a little bit more simple, doesn't it?
But I like if I'm using fill, I now prefer continuous, just for that reason, that I think it's kinder on the wildlife as well. Sure. Again, not always. I won't be a hypocrite, and I'll be very transparent, but I will now stop and think, am I taking this for fun, or am I taking this because I can get a conservation message out there? And if I do it just because that'll look like a cool shot, I probably won't do it. Whereas if I go, look, I realize that, there might be a stress level of 1 out of 10, and I will speak to the experts and go, what do you think of the go? It'll be fine. Then yeah, sure. Because I think I can get something positive out of it.
Yeah.
For the wildlife, not for me.
Yeah, sure. And actually, we haven't talked, leading on from your lovely wombat image, which is in the Wildlife Photographer of the Year this year. This is
maybe I should be complimented to do with that you think I use flash and I don't.
Yeah,
I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of the metadata, and I'm pretty sure I didn't. It'll be when people look at the Wildlife Photographer of the Yearbook, it says whether flash is or isn't. But I'm going to say I'm 90% certain I didn't.
Sure. Well, look, yeah, we can check that out. But also, I think what you said is true, and that's certainly my mission when using flash is you light it almost like there's no flash.
Yeah.
And the idea is that you're not blitzing the animal. You're just knocking out some shadows, getting a bit of separation from the background. And if you can do it in a very subtle way, that's the best way.
And if you do need to use a bit of flash, I like shooting it from behind because it gives some depth, and secondly, it's less stressful on the wildlife because they're not seeing it per se.
Yeah, sure.
That sort of rim lighting and side lighting.
Yeah,
as well.
So when I asked you about coming on this podcast, you sent me some lovely images.
Did I?
Of the wombats? Yeah.
Okay.
And so can
which ones?
Well, they were.
Was the one of the girl holding it?
Yeah, one of the girl holding it. It was a lovely dark one with close up of the hands holding the small, looked like a very young.
Oh, that was okay. That
was this all part of the same.
That
same
was
shoot?
That was all natural light. That was only shot 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
and basically that lady whose name I've forgotten. That's awful. Is a second-year veterinary student and looking after a wombat whose mother had been hit by a car, and a really nice backstory that a policeman drove past the wombat, stopped, checked the pouch. There was a baby wombat in there. He called a wildlife rescuer, and the only one could get there had to drive nearly 100 kilometres.
Wow.
From out of Melbourne into Melbourne because there was no other ones available. Took it to another carer. So this person did about 200K return trip. So, I think it's a beautiful story of humanity of the policeman stopping, the wildlife carer driving that distance. And then this second-year vet girl was in between feeding, I think, and she was sitting near a window, and the lighting was perfect. But for that one, I can guarantee there's no flash.
Yeah,
it is all window lighting,
and
I love that because it is quite dramatic if you get it right.
Yeah, of course. But this story in itself is this, and again, a little bit about your process of shooting. Do you find out about these stories, you get the access, and will you just try and go in and get as much as you can, and then think about sending it off to a magazine or whoever to try and get that work published, or is this something that you'll spend more time, you'll go back and revisit, make more connections and build the narrative and build the story?
Yeah, well, because it's a single wombat, I mean, I'm looking at doing a longer term piece on wombats and road trauma, and I'm going to cover, they suffer from mange. So it'll be a single piece about, maybe the life of wombats. But for me, a single image, partly I'll shoot that to get the story out there again about road trauma. I mean, there's two parts to that story that I think are really important. One is slow down. If you hit a wombat, check the pouch. That's that story that comes out. The other thing is the wonderful care and love that people go to look after these baby wombats. Now, sadly, a week later, that wombat died. It had a hernia, and they believe it got the hernia because when the mother was killed, before it got rescued, the weight of the mother squashed it and caused a hernia, and they weren't sure whether it would survive or not. So about 3 days later, it died, which is really, really sad. But I think that's important as well. If someone had checked the pouch earlier, maybe. So even checking the pouch, so do it quickly. So to me, it's, again, getting messages out there and to get what's the behaviour. I want people to slow down. That's probably not going to happen. But I want, if anyone sees a dead marsupial on the side of the road, check the pouch or call someone who could. So for that, it's an important image. Look, I'll probably enter it into a competition, and why do I enter competitions? In my youth, it was totally for ego and fame and recognition. I'll be totally candid. Now it's to get conservation stories out there, and competitions are a great way to get messages out there. I've got a series in this year's WildScreen, which is called Fighting the Heat, and it's about the stress that flying foxes are going under due to heat stress events. But there's a series of messages in there from heat stress events hurt animals. Animals can't go inside when it's hot. They don't have air conditioning, so there's that. And then on the other side, it's the wonderful work that Parks Victoria people do and Wildlife Victoria people do and other rescuers do to look after animals. So I think those stories are important to hopefully motivate people to do something, A, on climate change, and B, support those carers or become a carer. Again, driving behaviour.
Yeah.
which I don't think answered the exact question you asked.
But it's great. It's lovely.
But it is competitions are great for that. They get international awareness.
No, it's lovely hearing you talk about that in such a passionate way.
But I still have an ego. It is still great.
Well, that's important. We need to have egos.
I'm very, very honoured to, be in the top 100 this year and last year. And, it'd be disingenuous for me not to say, wow, when I get that email.
Of course.
But after that, I sit back and go, great, I can make a difference. And, like coming on podcasts like this, I strategically was going to talk about animal welfare and checking wombat pouches and considerations when you use Flash.
Yeah, and I've always said that, with our Fox book, even before the Fox book was published, I just talked to neighbours here on the street, and I'd made these short films and had to release some stuff on Springwatch digital series, and a couple of people came up to me and said, oh yeah, it's made me think twice about shooing them off when I see them. And that tiny little difference is like worth all the time that I'd put into making those short films. And you think, okay, well, that's good. You're making that little difference.
And I think to that person's question about Flash, I think, if I said one thing, it's works for the animals and in its use, be gentle.
Yeah.
With the use of Flash, it will be gentle for the animal. And it will make a more beautiful, and gentle lighting is beautiful lighting generally if you're doing wildlife anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
And if you're doing a sports person, harsh lighting, maybe, is very action orientated, but I think gentleness and kindness is a good way to think about it. And again, I do need to say, I don't always get it right. I make mistakes, and I'm totally happy to be called up when I do, but I try.
Yeah, good stuff. So we're going to wrap up. But what I was curious about, given your astonishing career in the last 12 years, you think about what you want to do in the next 12?
If I can survive, that would be great. Be 72. Good heavens. That's a really interesting question. Look, I think for me, it's pretty simple. I want to encourage people to treat the natural world more kindly. And that may be just with photography, that may be with policy. I like working close to home. I think for me, it's really important to work close to home for the reasons lower carbon footprint is obviously one. You have time to do things, but your fox shoot is 200 meters from your house. But also I think working close to home gives you a right to stick your nose in and say, it's not the person coming from overseas saying you should do this. So I know it's ironic that I've traveled 12,000 kilometers to talk about working close to home, but for me, it is about working close to home. And so, I can drive policy. I can if I catch up with a politician, I can not only do it because I care, I can say, hang on, you're my elected member. I recently got a scout haul after, let's call it bullying them, but badgering them pretty hard to get rid of all their barbed wire around their facility because it was around fruit trees, and bats and owls and possums were getting caught up in it. And we know that barbed wire has very little impact on preventing crime, because if you're a professional criminal, you're going to take wire cutters. So what it does do is it stops the random person jumping the fence. So you don't need 3 strands, you only need 1. And in this place, the fence was high enough they didn't even need barbed wire, so they changed it. And long answer to your question, it's my next 12 years will be working on issues closer to home, and it will be conservation, and I'll use imagery for that, whether it's film or not. But it will be trying to make the world just a little bit better, or if not better, make it less worse than it would otherwise have been.
Doug, it's been such a pleasure.
Oh no, thanks for the opportunity to ramble.
Really, really great. And now, you've flown 12,000 miles here. Of course, we're not all perfect, but you've got some good things to look forward to. You got WildScreen this week, Wildlife Photographer of the Year, and and now we're going to go and have some dinner, but hopefully you'll stay awake for that.
Yeah, what is it? It's 4:00 in the morning where I come from, so that'll be fun.
Well, I can tell you, everyone, he's looking great. And,
really, we call it breakfast. We'll reframe it as breakfast, and I'm fine. An early breakfast, I'm good.
Thanks again, Doug.
I appreciate it. Thank you for what you do, I should say, as well. And best of luck with your book, which is beautiful, and I'm getting a copy. So I suggest everyone else go have a look at one, and you will fall in love with the foxes as well.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
All right.
Many thanks to Doug. Not only did he manage to stay awake and deliver a great interview, I can tell you he didn't fall asleep in his food either. And what a treat, such a warm and generous guy doing so much amazing work, and like Clay Bolt, so much more than photography too. So I do hope you'll follow him. If you don't already, he's pretty active on social media. You can check out all the links on his page on my site. And I'm wishing you all a very happy Christmas. Hope you're enjoying yourselves. Hope this is a good time to kick back, listen to some podcasts. I've had some really great guests this year, and I've got some great ones, of course, lined up again next year. So stay tuned, keep sharing it. And also to let you know, for UK listeners, on the 28th of December, that's Wednesday at 8 o'clock, I filmed a sequence of the foxes that I photographed for many years, and got some great footage, and it's going out on the BBC. It's a whole new series, a 3-part documentary all about dogs in the wild. I haven't seen it, so I'm super excited to check it out, and I hope you can too. All right, see you in 2023. Goodbye.